Hi everybody, welcome to the first event of our new two-year programme, In Steps of Sunji, which explores the effects that extracting resources from the landscape has upon its occupants. Art and Energy Transition is a discussion led by Gina Glover and Dr. Geof Rayner, exploring the huge societal shift from low energy use to our current situation of high and climbing energy use. Where this shift transformed our lives, the effects on the landscape are dramatic yet often unnoticed. This discussion will consider the role that art might play in reflecting upon and engaging with these issues in ways that science, denying a role to either feeling or aesthetic sensibility, often fails to. Gina Glover is an artist trained in fine art at Chelsea School of Art and in photography at the University of Westminster, and has exhibited at galleries around the UK and at Photofest in Texas, United States. She co-founded Photo Co-op in 1979 in Wandsworth, which in 1991 became Photofusion Photography Centre based in Brixton. Dr. Geof Rayner is a health ecologist and former advisor to the Department of Health, European Commission and World Health Organization. Gina and Geof, welcome.
Thank you, James. I'm so pleased to be part of Firmin Wood's Contemporary Arts programme. This is an online presentation and we've never done this before. So please bear with us. And thank you to Martin Steed for his expert guidance over the technology.
So I'll kick off. Here's a wonderful quotation here from John Muir, the Scottish-American naturalist, and it sets the scene for us. It's the notion that nature and life is continuous, and it's also delicately balanced. It contrasts with much of the Western philosophical tradition, which puts human society and nature into different boxes, or more usually dualisms, such as nature and society, mind and body, and others. And it's reinforced by modern consumer capitalism with its emphasis on economic growth and the acquisition of things. People have come to see themselves above nature and separate, but in a superior way. And if the recent coronavirus outbreak has taught us anything, it's the risks to nature when they're exposed also become risks to our human survival.
For me, it's this realization was the start of my work. I have found that remote, wild and wasteland places, even if they are near to urban settings, can heighten my senses. I feel I am part of the landscape and not separate from it. I look at things in a different way. So here we have one of those wild, empty and very remote places. I've chosen it for the presence of the figure on the top left, looking out over a partially frozen sea. The figure in my mind stands for us all, watching a frozen sea melting and wondering about the consequences. The embryo of our project, the Metabolic Landscape, started with my visit to Iceland with my daughter Jessica in 2011. We were on a tourist boat in the Jökulsárlón Lake in southwest Iceland, and I came across these sublime iceberg mountains floating there. To experience the sublime is to have an experience that fills the mind. These natural, beautiful icebergs are also artifacts of scientific scrutiny. They provide a window into deep time, since they can be hundreds or thousands of years old. Glacier ice has little bubbles which preserve the atmosphere from the time when they were formed. Past climatic periods can be reconstructed, showing how and why the climate changed. An iceberg in the mist. Sometimes a photographer strikes lucky, and this extraordinary lighting condition was a gift. The icebergs which appear blue have been formed from old glaciers which have little internal air or reflected surfaces. When long-wave red sunlight hits the iceberg, it is absorbed rather than reflected, hence the ice appears blue or blue-green. Drinking this melted glacier water, as I did on this tourist boat, it really embodied this experience. It helped me to connect our sense of personal vulnerability to the vulnerability of the melting ice.
So let me explain this title of this book. Metabolism, the word metabolism comes from the Greek word for change, and it refers to the life-sustaining chemical transformations found within all living organisms. Metabolic diseases derive from energy imbalances. So the rise of metabolic diseases like diabetes, for example, has occurred because of the dramatic decline in our physical activity. At the same time, we've massively increased energy use drawn from nature. Now, another part of the title is the energy transition, and that denotes the historical shift from the old renewable energy sources like muscle power, wood, water, and wind, to fossil energy use occurring in the 19th century. First of all, coal, then gas, then petroleum. And of course, now we're seeing a new energy transition. We know we can no longer burn fossil fuels because of the danger to the climate, and yet, of course, we still do. So the remainder of this presentation begins with these two phases of energy transition. The first towards fossil fuels, and the second towards new renewable fuels, but obviously of a different technological kind. And again, what's a notion that underlies this photography? And it's captured by Sam Sturze, the director of the world's oldest and most famous photography meeting in Arles. One could reply negatively to Sturze that the investigative photography is not art. But that, we think, would be a very static understanding, where art is simply reduced to the decorative. Someone like Turner, our most revered artist, for example, never shied away from incorporating scientific, social, and political concerns in his paintings. He knew very well acclaimed scientists like Faraday in his day, and took account of new scientific theories in his paintings of the sun and his use of light. And this is ever present in his work. And so, to continue this point in the slide, photography can and must be a creative way of exploring our world. Whether it produces good or bad art is up to the viewer to judge.
To continue, a year later, we travelled to Greenland, and this time I was much more informed about climate change and its impact. Light and colour are critical features to my work. What was important to me was to create a coherent colour palette. So therefore, weather conditions were critical. I didn't want blue skies or sunshine, the kind of photography associated with the National Geographic magazine. Not that these pictures aren't wonderful, but I want my photography to work in an emotionally different way. The title of this Greenland series is called Water Held by the Cold, a term for the icebergs originated with the Danes who colonized Greenland, rather ironically given the present climatic situation.
So what is the situation? The last 5 years of open ocean temperature have been the warmest since measurement began. And there's a technical reason for that. 90% of the excess heat of the planet is stored in the oceans where it accumulates. There's both a risk of immediate and long-term ice loss, along with a long-term risk of ocean acidification or toxification, where in the very long run, no aquatic life can survive. Now, the scale of the Greenland ice sheet is enormous. It covers roughly 85% of the land surface of Greenland, and it rises to an average height of 2.3 kilometers. So much speculation has been engaged of what the melting will do to the ocean levels.
And for me, it was a shock to see the scale. of the glacier at first time. I did so by flying over Greenland from east to west and back again in a smallish public plane. And this has inspired my Melt series. Here are some of my images shot from a plane. I designed them attaching their GPS locations. The suggestion I hope they convey is a world melting by heat, looked upon through a plane cabin window. And here's two more from the series. So when they're exhibited as a block, and it's a series of 12. And the idea is that they should look slightly like etchings.
So what's the context for this work? Well, the melting of glacial ice is only one component of our planetary ecological crisis. And we've used this diagram in our work and our publications, and it's from a university in Sweden, where climate change fits within other threatened planetary boundaries. Climate change is linked, as I've said, to ocean acidification or toxification, land system change, biochemical flows, and changes in freshwater use. And of course, there's other problems as well, which we won't go into here. But focusing back to climate change, here is the projections of what could happen on the planet. And we know the last 5 and 10 years have been on the warmest on record, but looking ahead, the prospects become frightening. So the question is, we are likely to increase by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but if it increases up to 5 degrees, then frankly, life will become unbearable, not just for us, but for other species on the planet. It's a very big topic, and we're really putting it in the background now because we're looking at the photography, not particularly at the science. So we're going to shift now to coal, and Gina will say about some of her work on the Arctic, rather less on Europe, and we'll look at the impact of coal as a major factor in understanding climate change.
And as we know, the burning of coal is responsible for 46% of carbon dioxide emissions worldwide and accounts for 72% of greenhouse gas from the electric centre. As part of this investigation, we visited Svalbard, which is situated in the north of Norway, above Norway, shown in this map. Our project was funded by small grants, but since Geof was working in Norway, it made it possible for us all to visit there, both in winter, with 24-hour darkness, and in the summer, of course, with 24 hours daylight. Our first visit in the winter of 2013 was an incredible challenge, both navigating snow-filled roads and taking pictures in this complete dark environment. Early coal mining occurs in darkness, and what I realised, like a coal miner, you need to have with you torchlight attached to your head.
So mining has gone on here since the late 19th century. The town of Longyearbyen is named after the American John Longyear, who first established commercial mining here. It's a cold place, of course, but since 1971, temperatures have risen here by 4 degrees Celsius, 5 times faster than the global average. Here's a picture of a symbol of the old coal miners in the past in Longyearbyen.
So we returned there the following summer, and I found, or rather I was able to see, abandoned coal mining artifacts. These are protected by law, making this landscape resemble an outdoor museum or theatre set. This picture of the Titan crane was taken in midsummer. Close to Longyearbyen is the Russian town of Pyramidin, a ghost town. Russian occupancy of this region, controlled originally under Norwegian mandate, is as much about politics as coal. But as the ice melts, the possibility of the mining of other mineral deposits will open up. And I do recommend it, once we can travel again, for anybody interested in abandoned places that have been preserved by the cold. It is extraordinary because it's just how it was in 1998 when it was very hurriedly evacuated by the Russians. Mining in Svalbard, like all deep coal mining, is invisible from the surface. For this reason, I wanted to investigate very large-scale open cast mining. And this picture is from Cottbus North, an area of eastern Germany, the major source of coal for the former East Germany. Here, coal mining is the landscape, but a viewing platform is also provided for the visitor.
So here's what we see from the viewing platform. The modernistic power station in the distance burns the brown coal. What you see here is a covering of sand that's been removed and put back as they do the strip mining. And brown coal lignite is formed from compressed peat. It is the dirtiest coal there is. So Germany's energy plans call for a quarter of the coal mines to be shut by 2022, in 2 years' time. So mines are being shut down and reformed as huge lakes provided to stimulate tourism. And other mines are given over to vast photovoltaic solar farms. So we have a complete switch from the old tech to the new tech in one go. So what we're going to do now is look from a place where we can talk about a coal landscape to what we call the hydrocarbon forest in this set of pictures by Gina. Oil is the conventional word, or petrochemicals, for hydrocarbons. And it's interesting, this forest is a new forest where we're going to look at. And here's a wonderful statement from Franklin Roosevelt, who created it. There was a forest once before, but the forest we see today there on the same scale is actually a replacement of all the trees of the past. So it's a place of mismatch and contradiction. The first US oil well was established nearby in the 1880s. And this area once provided 80% of US petroleum. And here's what it was in the 1920s. This is a map of a placement. All those separate dots that you'll see on the screen are drilling efforts for oil. And this is the entire area of the forest which now covers them. So what was previously a forest was knocked down. What became an oil field then became an oil field in a forest, making it quite an unusual place. So here we have a forest, here we have an artifact from the old drilling days. This case, it's in a piece of abandoned drilling equipment. Well, it drives the drills, in fact, so, which is from the 1930s, and it's known as a control. As I said, oil drilling in Pennsylvania once covered the entire forest area. And to rescue what was left, it was purchased by the US government. But the government did not purchase the mineral rights or the oil drilling rights. And 6 companies today still have unfettered access to the forest, installing new roads to drill for oil. So we have a place which is both a forest and an oil field, or perhaps more correctly, an oil forest.
So what you see here and everywhere in this modern forest are old drilling works puncturing the ground. And in this picture, you see a pool of polluted water rising from the subsurface. Here we have an active drilling, but there is still the leakage of the water, and the emissions come from both.
And Roosevelt's statements, of course, about the forest being the lungs of the land are rather ironic from these pictures. As we were driving through the forest, you'll see a monitor, a particulates monitor, which is monitoring the how clean the air is and the particles from the drilling. As you can see, we're in the middle of the forest, but the particulates monitor is on red, which is the warning sign, and it's a very high reading. And below, you'll see what we were doing with an activist from our local green agency, using a special infrared video camera to assess gas leaks from this equipment. And
here is actually the result from these cameras, which actually shows the methane coming from the pipes. And if I was to exhibit this work, I would have a bank of videos actually showing this pollution. This community group have documented so many of the fracking wells and showing what is invisible and cannot be normally seen. Moving on, but of course we cannot visualize an underground process so easily. So what I did was to stimulate the experience with chemigrams, a constructed image made without a camera on light-sensitive paper. To make the image, I used crude oil brought back from the forest, salt, dead biological material, and I processed it with developer and fixative. Another image from that series, the rim, which I call the Hydrocarbon Landscapes. The originals are small, but I plan to rescan them and produce them very large.
so that was a mixture of abandoned and still working drilling equipment throughout the forest. But elsewhere in Texas, we looked at this more modern techniques of drilling and a vast area of abandonment, of many thousands of abandoned wells. It's probable that there are 2 to 3 times the number of abandoned wells as tracked by the Texas Railroad Commission, which is a rather quaint name for the regulator. As I said, the focus of US oil drilling shifted to Texas, where it's far larger in scale and less complained about. And so what you have is here, for example, abandoned equipment.
And in fact, I started photographing these without the actual knowledge of the methane that they were producing. And the reason that I started photographing them was that I actually had access to them. They're abandoned, and nobody is aware of you going up close to them. But of course, when you go up close to them, you're almost gagged with the emitting fumes. Here's a newly disused gas collecting station. It is unguarded with no surrounding fence. And on this occasion, if we'd had an infrared camera, we would have seen the methane being emitted from the pipeworks. And here I'm getting a bit more adventurous. I almost sort of climb into the tank, and here you see it. And as you can gather, it takes some time, in fact, to figure out what these abandoned bits of kit are for.
What we've been talking about so far is conventional methods of gas drilling. What we've seen so far represents the past, and the current phase is based on hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which has meant that the USA is now self-sufficient in oil. In fact, it's become an exporter. But this only happened because the industry successfully lobbied for the suspension of federal government legislative insight and controls over what it does in fracking. And of course, we've been having this discussion in this country, and there's currently a moratorium on it.
So here we are. This is actually what a fracking site looks like right at the beginning. It's the first sort of couple of days of when they start drilling, and then you'll see later on what it looks like afterwards. It's incredibly noisy, enormous amount of dust coming out, and a sign on the gate of this site says that they are going to be using 5 billion gallons.
Million gallons of water.
Not billions, millions of gallons of water. And now this is a different view of the same site. Trucks crisscross local towns delivering water and removing poisonous liquid waste for processing, some of which are pumped back into the underground. The fracking site releases toxic fumes and sand into the air, and of course the cows are at risk here from the site's pollution.
It's not just the chemistry pumped below ground, but the release of gases into the air. And we've already seen about leakages, but actually the main flow of gas is the unwanted kind. So this is called fugitive gas in the industry terminology. And where the gas is unwanted, or it's difficult or expensive to transport, it's simply burnt off on site. Moving on, this fracking pad is right beside the Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. And the Trump administration, which is cutting a swathe to environmental regulations, has now opened up millions of acres of the parks to more mining and oil and gas extraction. And fracking has overtaken conventional oil and gas drilling. The problem of unwanted gas has increased. And the mixture of gases which come out, and you're seeing the gas burning off here, is mainly methane, many other gases as well. But methane, in terms of the impact on the climate, is some 80 times greater than CO2. So while CO2 is the contemporary measure, this, what looks like a fairly large amount, is just burnt off, but it's 80 times the impact of something that we normally take for granted as the hallmark of how we measure climate impact. So here is a fracking pad after the processes in Pecos in Texas, and it's in the final phase of development. The spills are many, and a vast list of returned water and toxic chemicals are frequently pumped back into the ground, as Gina's said. The signs here warn on health and safety, and the whole enormous list of chemicals within the hydraulic fracturing fluids, dilute acids, biocides, corrosion inhibitors, friction reducers, potassium chloride, arsenic, benzene, and others, which are often pumped back into the earth.
And as we've said, fracking uses an enormous amount of water. And that's we think like 5 billion gallons.
Million gallons of water per pad. This means that some places, temporary artificial lakes are created. Whoops.
We missed one.
I missed one. I'm going back.
Okay, so because of the water situation, people are selling water, and 50% of fracking occurs in arid areas of the USA. So moving on to a project which is developed from the fracking, where I've called it Poisoned Water Runs Deep. In the making of this work on fracking, I wanted to return to earlier images I had made of fracking wells in Pennsylvania and North Dakota. These wells have resulted in widespread problems of water pollution. But I first shot these in colour, and as such, I found them, the picture didn't particularly convey what I wanted to convey, and how, in fact, does photography deal with the invisible subsurface threat to groundwater. So it's pretty difficult to do, but what I decided to do with this was to change these images back into black and white and reverse portions out to make this landscape look very strange. Other images in this series, here are oil containers where I've made the sky quite dramatic, but the viewer might lose seeing the fugitive gas because you can't see it as burning red. And I was tempted to keep the red colour of the flame, but actually that wouldn't have worked. And here we have brine water, which contains salts and usually other chemistry. And to see how I've exhibited this work, here are these images on display at Groundworks Gallery in King's Lynn, alongside their permanent Richard Long mud painting. I might conclude with the observation that in the US, that fracking is now in a financial crisis.
I'll say something about that in a little while. As part of the need to understand how oil drilling works, water is central. It was central, in fact, 100 years ago, where water was used to flood the underground area in Pennsylvania to drive water up to the surface. And as the way of separating water from oil, the quality of immiscibility is critical. So here, in this series called Immiscible Realities by Gina, she uses that differentiation between water, the heaviness of water, and the separating out qualities of immiscibility. So you extract the oil from floating it above the water and tapping it off.
And in fact, I've actually collected the brine and the oil mixture from the forest and amazingly got it through customs and brought it back from there to make this series of pictures.
So moving on, we wanted to move from fossil energy, and this is just a portion of the overall work we've done, of course, to renewables. And renewables, of course, is what before the 19th century, most of our human energy use was based upon. The Doomsday Book, as I've said here, listed around 6,000 water mills in England, and the world's first hydroelectric power was in Cumbria, as long ago as 1878. So here we are. Let's begin with this sentimental image. And the power of Holland, of course, and the Dutch economy way back in its golden age was the effectiveness of windmills, both for grinding flour and pumping water. And this, to me, which Gina took, is a sentimental old image, because I'm from this area in the Wirral. Bidston is the name of the Bidston Hill, and it resembles more a Dutch master than a wind turbine. And I first saw it in the early 1950s from the vantage point of a pushchair. And a very different image is of hydroelectric power. So here we're in North Dakota, famous today for the amount of oil produced by fracking, but actually hydroelectric power, as I've said, is old. And this lake in North Dakota was formed in the late 1940s, and it required the forcible removal of the indigenous people there who lost their agricultural land and livelihoods. So we're not saying that renewable energy is problem-free at all.
And in contrast to this, we have something very much smaller. Some parts of northern Wales receive 300 inches of rain a year. It's the best place for hydro development. And there are over 4,000 potential sites which could be developed. Small as this one shows can be beautiful. It was magic that the evening sun illuminated the station door, and a real adventure in actually finding it.
And we're back to North Dakota again, just to say that the landscape was once determined by farming in North Dakota. And here we are, an old abandoned farm building in this place, which in the winter goes to 40 below. And it's been taken over in part by wind farming. So while North Dakota's oil economy is booming, an enormous amount of energy, electrical energy, is produced from wind turbines. Moving on.
And back to Europe, you will see this very neat, almost doll's house village. It's called Feldheim. in Brandenburg, Germany, which is famous for being entirely self-sufficient in all forms of energy, from wind, biogas, and sun. And the coloured roof tiles are made of textured glass and retain heat. And there wasn't a person in sight. Here is a cluster. The cluster of unusual energy objects is the Plataforma Solar de Almira, an experimental centre of solar energy in southern Spain. Great images that one could actually take there. And moving back to Iceland, and I was fascinated at all their energy plants, which are all geothermal. And here we have a geothermal borehole in Kafla, which really smells. I loved the striking, often experimental designs of these objects, often in otherwise empty landscapes. And here is another one, a retro geodesic dome, and something much more basic and simple and rusty.
So, something which is neither fossil nor renewable is nuclear power. And one of the questions that's been posed for the environmental movement, I suppose, to answer is that there's a problem in being entirely reliant on renewables. So some have argued, including climate scientists like Hansen, that we require a backstop of having nuclear. But following the Fukushima event in 2011, and of course other events before that, one study from MIT, the famed university in North America, has estimated that given the growth of nuclear power from now on, there will be at least 4 serious nuclear accidents over the next period until 2050. And we wanted to look at a society which was extremely reliant on nuclear power. And therefore we visited France, where roughly 75% of electricity is generated by nuclear. And this is one of the French nuclear sites with the electrical power apparatus coming from it. And so we traveled through France photographing nuclear plants. Here's one. And we took many of them, in fact. And we thought, what's the situation in Britain where, if you like, the nuclear power generating capacity has been in crisis? And here's an example of an old nuclear power station, which is very costly and being closed. The cost of decommissioning nuclear power stations rivals the construction of new ones. And this one at Trawr Ffyn in North Wales is supposed to care and repair by 2030 and eventually be cleared by the 2090s. So it's a long-term undertaking to get rid of old nuclear power. So, conclusions. We began with an argument that nature is continuous with our lives, and the landscape is being reworked and to a degree threatened as we change it to fit in with our increasing demands for energy. For climatic and other reasons, it can't continue. Climate change, climate heating, pollution, toxification have been known to science for more than a century. The first measure of climate change were in the 1920s, which explains why scientists themselves have been increasingly vocal advocates for climate action. But science, as we know, provides a solid basis in facts and logical understanding, but it's much poorer at addressing feeling and experience. And here is where we think the arts can offer an emotional appreciation that rational and logical science has great difficulty in doing. But it requires to be investigative and not merely present something without taking on the science too. So without abandoning traditional landscape and documentary methods, we want to make image making, which is pluralistic in the way it does things. And this is the course that Gina's work is taken.
I suppose for me, the straight documentary photography doesn't often achieve exactly what I want, which is often to denormalize a scene or give interest and therefore attention. It is therefore why I often explore methods such as digital manipulation, chemigrams, and infrared video photography to highlight what cannot be seen with the naked eye.
So we'll leave you with this last picture, that change can happen, but often it's involuntary change. And this shows the decline of pollution in the Wuhan, north of Wuhan in China, in the last very rapid period. And we leave you with this image of NO2 density in northern China. And we presume that this is true of many other regions of the world as industrial production phases down. So we'll end there, and thank you, and very happy to take questions.
Thank you too.
Thank you, Gina and Geof. Audience feedback already that it was fascinating, thought-provoking and disturbing, which I think is all true. For me, the discussion reminds me of James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis that the Earth is a self-regulating system. My first experience of Gaia was through a Earth planet simulator computer game that was developed alongside James Lovelock in the 90s. And in the game, you were given a budget of energy where you could mold the planet like a god, setting up a planetary system, helping a particular species gain mastery of the planet, and ultimately influencing life to keep it from destroying itself. And you trigger events like volcanoes, raise temperatures, increase the surface albedo effect to deflect sunlight to lower temperatures again. Millions of years would translate into minutes or hours of game playing time. My mum would tell me I'd been on the computer for too long, and eventually appropriate evolutionary steps would take place. But for me, what became more interesting was when civilizations would occur. As life allegedly became more intelligent, your energy quota would increase. And you complete the game through investing energy in technology to leave the Earth or terraform Mars, or even by achieving symbiosis with the Earth so the biosphere would never be endangered. In both cases, without investing adequate energy in the arts or philosophy, civilizations in the simulation would quickly destroy themselves through a war or through a rapid reduction in the quality of life. So I wonder, for you two, how fundamental to the human condition, and by extension, the condition of the planet, do you consider the arts?
Well, that's who do you want to do?
No, you're going to do that.
Well, my feeling is I'm very much a Darwinist evolutionary thinker, and I think what makes humans special. It used to be thought that it was the use of tools or the use of language. Well, that's partly true, but I think it's in the use of our imagination, our use of our creativity, and the arts play a role in that. The German thinkers like Goethe and his friend Schiller in particular, considered there to be a play drive. Words like musement was part of that, where the arts aren't simply a decorative form, but the way we think, the way we imagine, the way we reconstruct possibilities, think about the past and think about the future. So the arts aren't simply this extra bit, which we get from sort of utilitarian thought, but absolutely critical to understanding who humans are. That creation, the idea of making, the notion of culture, comes from an artistic play. And we have an enfeebled version of ourselves and of our society if we don't consider the arts critical. And I think from Gina's work, what we're saying is that the problem with sciences and science is based on creativity too, but there is also an aesthetic component with science. So we're trying to not separate art from science, but actually draw out the creative components of both and seeing how they run together. And I think the future demands that art and science is not separate, but runs together.
Yeah, I so agree with this. And for me, my art is very much about investigation. And a lot of the way I actually make the images or think about them or read and research about them, you know, I know from actually doing a lot of art in hospitals and working with scientists there, you know, I'm trying often to mirror, but also to make my image having a connection and a metaphor and a broad communication with the images that I'm trying to produce. So for me, the context of where my images are shown is actually critical. I love beautiful icebergs, but beautiful icebergs on their own don't really interest me. They interested me at the time and they were fabulous to take, but it's actually finding out about them, understanding them, and understanding what is actually happening now, and wanting to actually put that across to other people. But having said that, it was actually that experience in Iceland, which was so overwhelming for me, which made me want to investigate climate change, want to connect with a lot of what Geof's research has been about, whereas previously we hadn't worked together, and I did, you know, site-specific work, but not to do with climate change.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Emma.
Hi, yes. So on that note, really, so you two work together in this amazingly close and productive and challenging way, and you talk about the scientific community embracing the arts in which to communicate this massive problem that we have. But I suppose when you're talking about all the commercial industries and the way that they're devastating the planet, and how administrations like the Trump administration are going back on the environmental laws that were put in place to protect people in place. So, Gina, it's a question for you. Have you ever been, with all your kind of investigative photography and climbing down holes and everything that you've been doing, have you ever been challenged by commercial industries as to why you're there, what you're doing?
A lot of the work I was making, as you saw, was in America, and I'm English, and I've got quite an English accent, and it was very useful to me, and I'm of a certain age. So when I got accosted, and I did get accosted by the oil industry and the guys guarding the fracking sites, I would just laugh and say, I'm just taking, I make pictures of industrial locations, and, you know, isn't this extraordinary? And I would bluff my way out of it. And people, because in fact I make myself visible, I don't hide myself. So I often have quite an illuminated jacket on, but also I look a bit chaotic and pretty harmless. And I use that. But I mean, one of the things that perhaps you didn't realize was that when we were doing the fracking pictures in Texas, it was actually very dangerous because I had to keep going backwards and forwards across a road, and there were these huge trucks going alongside, and there were people actually sort of guarding the fracking sites. So that was quite a challenge, but also quite exciting.
I have to say, to add to Gina's point about taking pictures in Texas, the real worry becomes because there are no police anywhere and there are no speed limits. So whereas in Pennsylvania, the speed limit is rigorously maintained, you have huge trucks carrying oil or water or sand going along the highway at 80 miles an hour, which would take them several miles to stop. And the unregulated nature of the society produces the risks. Generally, if you talk to people, you can charm them out of anything. And Gina is particularly good at that. So we've not had a problem in the States.
But having said that, in Pennsylvania, it was much more of an issue and there were campaigns against it. So when I took that first shot of the fracking wells and you've got all that machinery, I had to be really careful not to stand on their bit of land. And the trucks were sweeping past me and they were almost trying to run me down. Whereas when you're in Texas, it doesn't occur to anybody you could be against what you're actually seeing. So in fact, you're with a sort of society who doesn't notice what is going on and isn't perturbed about it and can't believe that you could be against it.
Well, it supplies jobs, basically.
Yeah.
Any more questions, James?
Right. Given where we are now, thankfully, in a time of needing to listen again, I can work alongside scientists to communicate more effectively.
Okay, Gina, I think if you look at an organisation like Wellcome, just to say about the Wellcome Institute, is that this is one of the main funders in the country of art and science. And they have a very large art program and want to involve people in it. And I think that's an exemplar, really, of what should be happening. It's interesting, we were in Texas at the PhotoFest exhibition, photography festival. And many of the art exhibitions on the Anthropocene, on the impact of the oil industry, were actually funded by the oil and gas industry. So, there is this ironic position that you're put in sometimes, because the formal enemies are the people who are actually funding you. So it's an irony that people in Texas or North Dakota or many other places, or as we've seen within the British arts establishment, when you have the funding of the arts by BP, or as it used to be, also the tobacco industry. So you have the people who you're opposed to actually funding the venues that you're displaying your work at. And it's one of the ironies of life. What is good news is, of course, that the arts community have been biting the hand that's been feeding it, and objecting to the money going into the Tate and other galleries, as it should be.
You also find, when I took the pictures in Germany, in Cottbus North, Germany is really very prepared to discuss the whole situation over coal. And therefore, I mean, it was significant that they built that platform so you could take those images. Whereas if you tried to, and I investigated taking images in America of coal mining, it's a nightmare. You can't do it, you get arrested. And even worse, in Canada, in the tar sands, which I also wanted to look at, how Botansky does it, of course, is, he has a private plane and he uses drones, and that's how he gets through it. But, we weren't on that kind of budget. And also a lot of the time when you're looking at such a vast landscape, you do need to climb up high, or you do need to be from a plane. So the actual technicality of actually getting the images you want is quite difficult. And, you're constrained often by budget to do that.
And it's anyway, if people have looked at Botansky's work, his book called The Anthropocene, and his other work, it is fabulous. But it's so different. And Gina's work is personal, and in the arts, there's a space for very many different forms. And I think that's the case we've been making as well. Many different ways of portraying experience of the aesthetic character of the world, and long live variability and difference in arts as well as the sciences.
Great, thank you. I think we've got one more question from Emma, please.
Right, yeah. So this is to Geof, also both of you, I guess. So obviously we're, Trump's not part of this, but we're looking to move away from fossil fuels. We're exploring how different the benefits of different renewable energies, but also there's the other side of that is to how it affects communities and the landscape. You've also discussed nuclear energy as another alternative, but then there's problems with that in terms of the cost of decommissioning sites and the worry that other disasters will occur. So as there's this continual discussion and debate going around how we gain our energies, I was wondering what your take on that was as to where you think we should be going. I watched a program quite a while ago with Brian Cox, and I can't remember the science of it, but he was saying that there's potential for complete free energy for everybody. And I'm not a science boffin, but he was talking about replicating the sun, how that works, or a star. So I wondered if you could tell me a bit more about that, but also previously what I said, what's your favourable route forward?
Well, I mean, of course, Brian Cox, who is a keen photographer, by the way, and uses Photofusion in London, which Gina founded. He's keen into the arts and photography, and I applaud him for his wonderful science programs, which are beautifully made. But of course, the issue of technological development in energy is a really tricky subject, and there's an attempt to have fusion power, which is long-standing, and that's maybe what he was talking about on that occasion. But there's also hydrogen power, which the Japanese car companies are developing, and you can buy hydrogen cars because nothing comes out of the tailpipe. You don't have the problem of the long-term consequences of dealing with electrical batteries, which is another form of pollution, which you're putting into the future. So we really, and it may be also that we should give more attention to reducing the amount of power we use. Instead of taking our cars, we should mainly in London, for example, if we live in London or Birmingham or the cities, going on bicycles or more on foot. My background, by the way, I was one of the government's advisors on obesity, and I tend to view these things as running together. We increase the use of energy which we draw from the planet, so we increase that and we reduce the amount of energy that we take from our bodies. So if you like, the notion of metabolic disease is both planetary and physical. And now there are roughly 1 billion people on the planet who are overweight or obese. We looked at the US, 2/3 of the population of the US and over now 1/3 of the population of the US are now clinically obese. There's a link there with taking the automobile, or not walking, or not cycling, or not running, and so on. And you have this division between the very fit and the very fat. So we want to connect all of the dots, both making investments in new technologies, and particularly those technologies which are ecologically damage-free, and reduce some of our energy uses in order to put it back to bodies. The solution to the rise in diabetes is the rise of people walking. So let's connect these things together.
Diabetes is the rise of people walking.
Yes, it's used to be called adult onset diabetes 2, not diabetes 1, which is separate. Diabetes 2 used to be called adult onset diabetes, because as we get older, we tend to slow down and do less physical activity. But now, of course, we're seeing diabetes in teenagers. and that's caused by inactivity and overconsumption of food. So in order to counteract both, we need simply to do more physically in our lives. And so we need the total picture of energy use. And James said earlier about one of the features of humans being almost a degree of the way in which we view civilization is the more energy we have, the more energy we use, the more civilized we are. Well, maybe we should turn that around. The more economical we are with our energy, the more we use energy physically. There are words for these things, by the way. Using planetary energy is called exosomatic energy, and using energy by our bodies is called endosomatic energy. These were words invented back in the 1920s. And it's about the energy balance between humans and the energy balance between humans on the planet. I've just introduced a vast area of science and human society for discussion.
Just to go on for that and to think about what is actually happening now, and we're all sort of indoors and self-isolating, and we're having to change our habits. And I think in terms of our energy use, it's actually changing your habit. And I just hope, but I'm not sure that it'll happen, that we're now behaving in quite a different way. In fact, you can't buy any yeast because everybody's cooking their own food and things like that. How long-term that can be. And it worries me too that when you looked at that map of China, where you saw so much less sort of pollution in the air, but probably when everything gets back and running, they want to catch up. And so, in fact, it will be even worse. I don't know. But I'm hoping somehow by behaving in a slightly different way because of the circumstances that we are in, it may affect the way we think and understand our world.
Yes, and just to finalize that point, if you are fracking in the US at the moment, your costs of fracking are between $45 to $60 a barrel. The current price for oil is $20 a barrel. And many of the fracking companies in the US will be going out of business over the next year. So their economic reality has entirely changed. Right.
Hey, Geof. I mean, of Kossuth, that art is about having an effect as a maker and not in making more commodities in an already over-commodified world, which is perhaps something we can live by, not just in the arts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things that the coronavirus is teaching us is how to be by ourselves. And that's going to be very difficult for some people. Introverts, of course, will flourish during this period. Extroverts may have a problem. But we have to relearn and move away from a society based upon the habits that our addiction to energy, from our addiction to commodities, our addiction to this and that, and relearn how to live between the planet's boundaries. And we can do that, but it requires not just optimism, but a realistic version of how we've been plundering the planet and how our lives can be made richer through the arts and through enjoyment of the production of art in a more sustainable way. And that means more of us engaging in the arts, not just the very privileged ones whose work is acclaimed, but all of us in different ways becoming creative people rather than just consumers of other people's art. And I think probably that's a notion Gina would go along with as well.
Absolutely, yes. In fact, it's funny to think about that subject because I trained as a painter at Chelsea in the 60s, and there I was in front of huge, great canvases with my roll of masking tape, which was actually, very important to use to make the abstract shapes. And found it quite difficult. I thought, what is the purpose of this? And in fact, there was a big gap before I became an artist again, because I never picked up a paintbrush after leaving Chelsea in the 60s. But I realized that what I wanted for me was this kind of communication and joint way of actually debating things and having discussions and making images, which I suppose I've always done since the 80s, about something that I'm very concerned about. In the 80s, it was much more about local campaigns, feminism, women's issues. And it was actually a joy to get back to a subject which I really cared about and, wanted to sort of find ways of actually talking about it.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks both. So thank you to the online audience, and thank you to Martin Steed for connecting us. Our funders, Arts Council England and the Kenneth Fund. And this is the first event in our new 2-year programme, which is part of the Northamptonshire Prize Year of Arts and Culture. So let's hope for more than 1 year.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us and listen to us drone on, but without Botansky's drones. So I'll leave you that little joke. But I do recommend, we do have a book, and it's called The Metabolic Landscape, and it's available from Firmin Woods. And Gina and I have donated multiple copies, which I recommend you obtain. And these will be available when they're available.